The economic situation in Venezuela continues to go from bad to worse, and things are unlikely to get better, experts have warned. This week, Venezuela's Congress was stripped of its powers over the budget, viewed as a move by the country's President Nicolas Maduro as an attempt to consolidate power. On top of this, the country lacks many basic goods and inflation is out of control. Year-on-year inflation is expected to reach 700% this year, and UBS forecasts it will reach 1,500% next year. The country also faces shortages of food and medicines, he added. Children are dying, Moyo Campos added. The elderly are dying in Venezuela, and a recall referendum against incumbent President Nicolas Maduro, which was expected to terminate early his mandate and pave the way for a new leadership, is being basically blocked. Blame for the crisis lies on 15 years of populist policies by Venezuela's government, according to Michael Henderson, lead economist at risk analysis firm Verisk Maplecroft. The government has scared away private enterprise and nationalized large swathes of the domestic economy, leading to stagnant growth and chronic inefficiency. Investment in productive capacity and infrastructure has been insufficient to meet growing demand, fueled by super loose monetary and fiscal policy. This is a toxic mix which almost inevitably results in a rapid acceleration of inflation. The Venezuelan economy heavily relies on oil, so the collapse in oil prices in recent years hit the country hard, resulting in a balance of payments problem. Overall, the outlook for Venezuela is grim, says Henderson. Regardless of whether the government is able to avoid a debt default in the near term, an inevitable macroeconomic reckoning is approaching which will have painful repercussions for ordinary households and businesses, he added. The theory of state capitalism has played a critical role in the international socialist tradition's critique of regimes claiming to be socialist. In the first of the New Revolutionary Reflections articles, Mike Gonzalez presents an account of the latest developments in Venezuela which draw on that tradition to make sense of changes that are taking place. His article explores changes to the system, and the growth of a new ruling class around President Maduro following the death of Hugo Chavez. Introduction. The Bolivarian Revolution led by Hugo Chavez from 1999 opened a new chapter in the global struggle for social justice. For anti-capitalists across the world, his 21st-century socialism pointed ahead to a new kind of power, defined in the Bolivarian constitution as participative, a white protagonist, a participatory democracy in which the people were the active subjects. It is hard to reconcile that hope with the realities of Venezuela today. The spokespersons of the new state continue to proclaim their revolutionary credentials. Yet they oversee a society in profound and worsening crisis, where hunger has reappeared in a country which just 4 years ago was congratulated by the UN for its virtual elimination of extreme poverty. The right-wing media, nationally and internationally, have taken great delight in publishing photographs of food queues marshaled and overseen by armed National Guards. The supporters of Chavismo instinctively refuse to believe the images. But the social crisis they symbolize is real. An economy in crisis. The levels of inflation in Venezuela have reached catastrophic proportions. The annual figure for 2015 was over 300%, and in 2016, even official sources recognize that it is approaching 600% or more. Translated into real lives, it means that a basket of basic goods and services for a family is now calculated at 400,000 bolivars, set against average wages of around 60,000. The government responds by pointing to the fair prices it regularly announces. but in reality the basic products to which those fair prices are attached are rarely available, and it is even less likely that they will be sold at those prices. It is universally recognized that the various commissions and ministries set up to oversee price regulation have failed completely. In fact, a number of people appointed to ensure them have been dismissed for involvement in fraud. The local Committee of Supply and Production, known by its Spanish acronym CLAP, is the assured baskets of basic goods to be delivered directly to consumers, and much heralded by the President, has been a failure too. They are administered by the government party, the PSUV, and distributed among its supporters, or to some of them at least. The claps are not reaching their recipients, and when they do, are rarely complete. In many areas they are trafficked, as on the island of Margarita. The enormous queues at practically every supermarket start to form at 3 or 4 in the morning. The minimum wait is for 5 hours, but there is no guarantee of what will be available when you reach the shelves. The supplies of products at regulated prices are limited, and there are reports that the National Guard controlling the queues themselves take a proportion of the products for resale. A glance at the contents of a plastic bag carried by a weary shopper finally emerging from the supermarket after a 5 or 6 hour wait is telling. It will contain only basics: flour, oil, washing powder, perhaps rice or beans, the basis of the national diet. Margarine, butter is a distant memory, perhaps milk or milk powder. Where there are vegetables and fruit available at farmers' markets, their price is 10 or 20 times what it was a year ago. 10 kilos of fruit and vegetables a week will cost at current prices around 30% of the monthly wage. Bread at the maximum allowed of 2 loaves per person, assuming 10 per week for a family, will amount to another 16% or so. The number of external commentators in Europe and the US have insisted that there is no hunger in Venezuela. There is. The calorific intake of most Venezuelans is falling. Electricity, transport, hospitals, schools are falling into physical disrepair and are increasingly unable to offer the services they promise. Water is rationed to once a week, and electricity severely curtailed. Public offices run 3 days a week, schools 4 days. The situation of medicines and drugs is particularly distressing. Whole ranges of necessary medication are simply unavailable, and that includes aspirins and plasters, birth control pills and anticonvulsants. The growing number of incidents of looting, now a daily occurrence, are evidence enough of mounting frustration. The crisis has been accelerating since late 2014. What is astonishing is there is no sign of any strategic response from the state or indeed the National Assembly. Instead, Nicolas Maduro, who is fond of long combative speeches, delivers daily denunciations of the economic war, the conspiracy that he insists is responsible for the dire situation most Venezuelans are now living through. The reality is a great deal more complex. The groups that dominate the supplies of food and drink are almost certainly hoarding goods, as happened in Chile before the coup against Allende in 1973. Then as now, the purposes are both economic and political. Prices are raised arbitrarily, and each time goods reappear on supermarket shelves after a long absence, their price has risen. Black beans are part of the basic diet. The fair price for half a kilo is 60 bolivars. They are currently on sale at 4,000. This is one example of many, but the proportions are roughly the same for most products. At the same time, the absence of the most basic goods, and the total unpredictability of their supply, adds to an atmosphere of collective anxiety and insecurity. Because wages cannot buy what is necessary, The phenomenon of voucherage has spread through every level of the society. It refers to the reselling of goods, acquired by a range of means, through networks. Some of those goods are the ones bought at fair prices and then resold, in the poor barrios, at higher prices, but still less than those of the local shop. This applies to everything, from food through spare parts to cement or cars. And if there is an economic war waged against the population, those responsible come from both the business sector and the state. Many members of government, of the state, and of the armed forces, are deeply enmeshed in the circuits of contraband and resale. These extend across the frontiers to Colombia, where vast quantities of goods of every kind are resold at even higher prices with the complicity of the military, the National Guard, and in many cases local politicians too. Medicines unavailable in Venezuela are freely available in Colombian pharmacies. Some, including the one where I bought medication in Bogotá, are in fact Venezuelan-owned. The heart of the problem, however, is the trade in currency, the buying and selling of dollars. The reality is that there exist two economies here, the Bolivar economy and an unacknowledged dollar economy. The exchange system established under Chavismo offered dollars at a preferential rate to importers. The dollar can be bought from the central bank for 6 or 12 bolivars. The unofficial dollar price in 2016 has hovered around 1,000, and the prices charged for imported goods reflect their black market dollar value. The profits to be made by speculators are enormous. $1,000 bought at official prices, say 12,000 bolivars, could bring in over 1 million when translated into goods or invested abroad. It was too tempting a price to resist for all concerned, from functionaries, bank directors, importers to politicians. Furthermore, the state itself is a major importer of services, technology, and increasingly of materials and consumer goods. Every multi-million-dollar trade involved equally gargantuan commissions, bribes, money laundering, and capital flight. The actual figures are hard to come by, given the extreme scarcity of government data. But the ex-minister of the economy, Jorge Giordani, in a letter signed by several leading ex-members of Chávez's government, estimated that at least $460 billion had disappeared in this way. The real figure is likely to be far higher. The second consequence of this combination of disinvestment and capital flight was the collapse of domestic production. Some capitalists, like the enormously powerful head of the Polar Group, Lorenzo Mendoza, moved production outside the country, in his case to Colombia and later Miami. Others simply abandoned production altogether. In these cases the government bought the plants. It did not expropriate them, since it paid market rate compensation. But in every case production fell, as a result of mismanagement and corruption, even in the flagship EPS social enterprise sector. This is not a phenomenon exclusive to Venezuela. The Dutch disease, as it is called, appears to afflict all oil-producing economies. There is, however, a fundamental difference here. The Bolivarian project assumed that oil revenues would be socialized and redistributed for the social good, and that a proportion up to 60% would be reinvested in new industries to diversify the economy and address the dependence on oil of which the Dutch disease was a manifestation. If there in fact an economic war underway, then a radical government should surely respond by taking control of production, establishing control over foreign trade, aggressively preventing currency speculation, and genuinely controlling prices. More importantly still, it would act resolutely against the corruption which has financed the emergence of a new ruling class, which includes both the private capitalists and the new Chavista bourgeoisie, who have collaborated to create a reorganized Venezuelan state capitalism. The definitive proof of this reversal of the Chavista project is the Arco mineral program, to which I return below. Instead, the profiteers have continued to make their huge gains and the working population has faced increasing misery, while a socialist government has looked on and done nothing. The Venezuelan government's political future may be murky, but its immediate priority is clear: to block the opposition's attempt to recall President Nicolas Maduro. On October 20, 3 governors belonging to the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela (PSUV) announced that the penal courts of their respective states had determined that the opposition had pursued its referendum movement illegally. Courts in Apure and Monaga states quickly followed suit. The judicial rulings against the referendum, though confined to the state level for now, could jeopardize a national movement if the Supreme Court upholds the lower circuit's decisions. Venezuelan opposition figures, fearing this might be the case, have accused the Supreme Court of preparing to halt the recall vote in its tracks. 2 of the governors in question, Carabobo State Gov. Francisco Ameliach and Aragua State Gov. Tarek L.A. Sami, are longtime allies of former National Assembly Speaker Diosdado Cabello, who is angling for the vice presidency. The position would enable Cabello to eventually assume the presidency, should Maduro resign in 2017. Though Cabello and Maduro have often been at odds with each other, they have found common ground in stonewalling the recall vote, at least until next year. Cabello, for his part, likely hopes that by averting the presidential upset, he himself can avoid being imprisoned in Venezuela or extradited to the United States, which is currently investigating drug trafficking allegations against him. But despite the two men's unity on this matter, the PSUV does not appear to be acting as a single, cohesive party. In the past few days, the Venezuelan government has made several seemingly contradictory decisions. On October 17, the National Electoral Council announced that gubernatorial elections set for the fourth quarter of 2016 would be delayed until mid-2017. A decision that poses a great risk to many PSUV governors, since voters may turn against the party at the polls as backlash over inflation and food shortages spreads. Meanwhile, Maduro has been holding a series of meetings with former Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero and U.S. officials on opening the dialogue between Caracas and the Venezuelan opposition. Several factions other than the Maduro administration, however, are exerting influence over the talks, including a group led by Cabello and his allies. Though Cabello and Maduro both seek protection from incarceration or persecution by any future administration headed by the opposition, that appears to be where their shared interests end, and the two are reportedly conducting completely separate negotiations with U.S. officials and political rivals. Likewise, the 5 governors may be acting on the orders of Cabello and his allies, independently of the president's wishes. Should the Supreme Court uphold the state court's decisions, the opposition is unlikely to get the legal approval needed to hold its recall referendum without gaining the cooperation of other government institutions. Given the PSUV's near-exclusive control over these institutions, such support would not be forthcoming. If the vote is cancelled, it will raise an important question as to whether major political figures will approve of Cabello's role in the matter. With the country under mounting economic strain, and state-owned energy company Petróleos de Venezuela inching closer to default, Cabello's attempts to deflect threats to his own power may do little to solve the country's, and ruling parties, deeper underlying problems. October 5. President gets his priorities in order. Venezuela's leaders are still looking for a way out of the crises surrounding them. On October 5, President Nicolas Maduro said that holding elections is not a priority for him. The statement refers not only to the recall referendum that the country's opposition has been pushing for, and that the government has been avoiding, but also to the gubernatorial vote that was scheduled to take place in November. Under mounting pressure from the opposition and from the United States, the president cannot defer elections indefinitely. Nonetheless, postponing the votes, or at least threatening to, could buy the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela PSUV some time. Even as U.S. lawmakers call to increase sanctions on Venezuela, Maduro's administration has more to lose in allowing the recall referendum and gubernatorial elections to go on. The country's dire economic problems have cost the PSUV and its leaders popularity among the public. If the gubernatorial elections were held in November as planned, the party would likely fare poorly. Likewise, if Maduro were recalled this year, the PSUV could well lose power in the new presidential election. Although many PSUV governors blame Maduro for their waning support, they would rather protect their positions, and that of the party, by postponing the elections and the recall referendum. In addition, several high-level figures in the party are under investigation by the United States for offenses such as drug trafficking and money laundering. Maduro likely hopes to use their talk of suspending the votes to exact concessions from the United States with regard to the criminal charges or sanctions. Washington has already opened a dialogue with Caracas, sending U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to meet with Maduro in Colombia on September 26. Still, it is unclear how the United States will respond to Maduro's comment about elections, since Washington has little to gain from negotiating with Caracas. Either way, elections in Venezuela will have to resume at some point. As much as the ruling party stands to lose in a referendum this year, it can't little it for the domestic unrest and international isolation that pushing the vote off indefinitely could bring. In the meantime, the PSUV will be working to figure out its next move. As Venezuela's political opposition keeps pushing for a referendum to recall President Nicolas Maduro, the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela PSUV is trying to secure its position in power. On September 28, Carabobo State Gov. Francisco Ameliach said that if the recall vote moves forward, Maduro will probably appoint Diosdado Cabello, the former National Assembly leader and close ally of Ameliach, to the vice presidency. At the same time, there has been speculation, especially since the 2015 legislative elections, that the post would go to Cabello's longtime rival, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. Either way, the rumors suggest an effort by Maduro's administration to ensure the party's continued influence in the country and to protect its interests in the event of a successful referendum. Ameliach's comments may be little more than an attempt to ruffle the Democratic Unity Roundtable amid Venezuela's opposition coalition. Cabello's appointment would stir up controversy in and beyond Venezuela. Over the years, the U.S. Justice Department has indicted several members of the PSUV government, including Interior Minister Nestor Rivero, the former head of the National Guard. Though Cabello does not currently face charges, he is close to the indicted officials and is generally perceived to be corrupt. In May, The Wall Street Journal published an article alleging that Cabello was under investigation by U.S. federal prosecutors for money laundering and drug trafficking. Cabello, in turn, sued the newspaper for libel. Nonetheless, the conjecture over his appointment reflects the difficult position that the ruling party has found itself in. So far, the PSUV has managed to deflect the opposition's demands for a recall referendum. which the ruling party hopes to defer until at least 2017 to avoid early elections. As Venezuela's economic situation continues to deteriorate, however, the Maduro administration's future looks more and more uncertain. If the party is forced into holding a referendum after this year and Maduro is recalled, his vice president will take over until 2019, when the next presidential vote is scheduled to take place. Both of the possible candidates to assume the vice presidency seem to agree that a referendum this year should be avoided. After all, if the opposition rises to power in the wake of Maduro's recall, it could enact laws that would allow some fallen PSUV officials to be extradited to face charges in the United States. September 26. The chances of a 2016 presidential recall grow slimmer. The Democratic Unity Roundtable MUD, Venezuela's sole opposition coalition, has refused to accept the government's terms for a referendum to recall President Nicolas Maduro. On September 25, the party's executive secretary said MUD would reject the National Electoral Council's requirement that the opposition collect signatures from 20% of registered voters in each state in order for the vote to be held. Rather than meet the council's high bar, the MUD called on September 26 for Venezuelans to provide their signatures October 26 to 28. Indicating that the opposition intends to gather support only from 20% of voters nationwide. The coalition also advocated daily protests and announced plans for a demonstration to be held across the country on October 12. The Maduro's administration was able to extend the 20% benchmark mandated by the Constitution to all Venezuelan states is, in itself, significant. It signals that despite the ruling party's internal divisions, all of its leaders appear willing to support the president's efforts to put off the referendum until 2017, if not indefinitely. Their backing puts the Maduro government on more stable ground by reducing the risk of an immediate recall vote. Should Maduro successfully delay the referendum until next year, the decision to remove him from office, the president's worst-case scenario, would still leave fellow party member and Vice President Aristobullo to rise in power. Though MUD will continue to push for the referendum to be held in 2016, it is unlikely to be successful on its own. Maduro's administration controls enough of the political establishment to delay the vote past the end of the year. Resorting to disruptive protests, such as those seen in 2014, is not an ideal option for the opposition either, since the government's security forces could shut down any demonstrations quickly. Protests would also risk dividing the coalition, since some of its factions likely would not support inciting widespread unrest. The bigger challenge for MUD lies beyond December. The government appears to be united in its attempt to shut down the referendum movement this year, and possibly the next. Should it succeed, MUD's effort to position itself as a viable alternative to the ruling party ahead of Venezuela's 2019 elections will be made all the more difficult. Unless social unrest stemming from Venezuela's economic deterioration boosts the opposition coalition's popular support base, its hopes of forcing the recall referendum in 2016 are unlikely to be realized. August 15, a controversial court case threatens wider protests. The Venezuelan opposition's efforts to oust President Nicolas Maduro are gaining steam as the end of the year approaches, and the recent court case may have just added fuel to the fire. On August 12, a Venezuelan court dismissed the appeal of opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez, who is fighting to overturn a 14-year prison sentence he received after being convicted of inciting violent protests against the government in February 2014. The demonstrations left 43 people dead and many others injured. The court's decision to throw out Lopez's appeal puts an end to rumors that his release was to be part of a potential deal to ease the rising tension between Maduro's party and the Democratic Unity Roundtable opposition coalition. Now, however, Lopez's case could worsen friction between the two and stir up greater unrest. The Democratic Unity Roundtable, eager to press forward with a referendum on recalling Maduro's presidency, has already announced a major nationwide protest to support its cause on September 1. The pro-Maduro demonstration is scheduled for the same day in Caracas. The denial of Lopez's appeal could draw even more participants to the opposition's rally. Lopez's case aside, the September 1 demonstration has taken on added significance in recent weeks as the opposition searches for opportunities to speed up the referendum process. Earlier in August, the National Electoral Council announced that the second phase of the opposition's efforts to collect the signatures needed to hold the vote to recall Maduro will take place at the end of October, a decision that makes it unlikely that the referendum could be held in 2016. If the vote is delayed until 2017, an outcome in favor of removing Maduro would lead to his being replaced with the vice president rather than the new elections that a referendum held this year could yield. With a new sense of urgency, the leaders of the recall movement are doing what they can to shorten the process's deadline. National Assembly Chief Henry Ramosola declared August 10 that regional elections are no longer a priority for the opposition, whose focus is now fixed solely on the recall referendum. Miranda State Gov. Enrique Capriles has weighed in as well, saying there is no reason not to hold the vote in 2016. Capriles also recently traveled to Peru to seek the support of Venezuela's regional neighbors and to ask Mercosur members not to allow his country to hold the bloc's rotating presidency. The opposition's efforts have paid off. On August 11, 15 members of the Organization of American States called on Venezuela to quickly complete the remaining steps in the referendum process. The Maduro administration has its hands full trying to address the shortage of basic goods, high inflation and economic decline wreaking havoc on Venezuela. But now it may have another problem: a greater number of participants in the September 1 demonstrations than it originally expected. To add to the list,